YouTube. It's your guy, Sports Law, broadcasting live today, July 31st, 2025. Today, in our live stream, we will be doing Major League Baseball games. My perspective in these games that we'll go over will be between August 1st and go every day, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and finish off with August 7th. What we're going to do is we'll go over who is playing on each of those days, the starting pitchers, any other pertinent information, and who I believe will win the games. I do not have the information on the money line or the over-under, so that will not be included today. Can y'all hear me out there in YouTube land? Well, let's get into this. For August 1st, it'll be Atlanta versus Cincinnati, 11:40 a.m., Bryce Elder versus Brady Singer. Baltimore versus the Chicago Cubs, 1:20 p.m. Trevor Rogers versus Cade Horton. Detroit versus Philadelphia, 5:45 p.m. Tariq Skubal versus Ranger Suarez. Washington versus Milwaukee, 5:45 p.m. Jose Quintana versus Mitchell Parker. You have Kansas City versus Toronto, 6:07 p.m. Michael Wacha versus Kevin Gausman. You have Houston versus Boston, 6:10 p.m. Hunter Brown versus Garrett Crochet. You have Minnesota versus Cleveland, 6:10 p.m. Joe Ryan versus Gavin Williams. The New York Yankees versus Miami, 6:10 p.m. Carlos Rodon versus Jansen Junk. You have San Francisco versus the New York Mets, 6:10 p.m. Robbie Ray versus David Peterson. You have Los Angeles Dodgers versus Tampa Bay, 6:35 p.m. Clayton Kershaw versus Shane Baz. You have Pittsburgh versus Colorado, 7:10 p.m. Andrew Heaney versus Antonio Senzatella. You have the Chicago White Sox versus the Los Angeles Angels, 8:38 p.m. Aaron Saval versus Tyler Anderson. You have St. Louis versus San Diego, 8:40 p.m. Matthew Liberatore versus Randy Vasquez. Arizona versus the Athletics, 9:05 p.m. Merritt Kelly versus Jacob Lopez. Or is that Merrill? That's Merrill Kelly, sorry. And you have Texas versus Seattle, 9:10 p.m. Jack Leiter versus Logan Gilbert. Now, what we're going to... Oh, and the times that I list on these will be in Central Time. Hello, Did. I'm glad that you're here. Hello, Naomi. I'm glad that you're here. I'm doing really well, Did. Just going over some Major League Baseball stuff. We just went over who is playing starting pitchers, and now I'm going to make my picks for who I think is going to win the game on August 1st. And to answer your question, Did, I'm doing pretty good. Thank you for asking. And I'm doing very well, Naomi. I appreciate you. Doing very well today. So my picks to win the game on August 1st, I have Atlanta defeating Cincinnati, Chicago Cubs defeating Baltimore, Detroit defeating Philadelphia, Washington defeating Milwaukee, Toronto loses to Kansas City, Boston beats Houston, Minnesota defeats Cleveland, Miami defeats the New York Yankees, San Francisco defeats the New York Mets, Tampa Bay defeats the Los Angeles Dodgers, Pittsburgh defeats Colorado, the Los Angeles Angels defeat Chicago White Sox, St. Louis defeats San Diego, the Athletics defeat Arizona, Texas defeats Seattle. Alright, so on August 2nd, you have Tampa Bay versus the Los Angeles Dodgers. You have Baltimore versus the Chicago White Sox. You have Kansas City versus Toronto. In the Los Angeles-Tampa Bay game is Undecided versus Drew Rossman, 12:10 p.m. Baltimore versus Chicago Cubs, 1:20 p.m. Tomoyuki Sugano versus Ben Brown. Kansas City versus Toronto, 2:07 p.m. Undecided versus Max Scherzer. You have Pittsburgh versus Colorado, 2:10 p.m. Paul Skinnis versus Austin Gomber. You have Detroit versus Philadelphia, 3:05 p.m. Jack Flattery versus Zach Wheeler. You have Milwaukee versus Washington, 3:05 p.m. Brandon Woodruff versus Jake Irvin. The Detroit-Philadelphia game is 3:05 p.m. Houston versus Boston, 3:10 p.m. You have Colton Gordon versus Walter Buehler. Let's see. You have Minnesota versus Cleveland, 3:10 p.m. Undecided versus Tanner Bilby. The New York Yankees versus Miami, 3:10 p.m. Cam Schlittler versus Yuri Perez. San Francisco versus the New York Mets, 3:10 p.m. Undecided versus Kodai Senga. Texas versus Seattle, 3:10 p.m. Jacob deGrom versus Luis Castillo. Atlanta versus Cincinnati, 6:15 p.m. Spencer Strider versus Chase Burns. Arizona versus Athletics, 9:05 p.m. Zach Gallen versus JT Ginn. Chicago White Sox versus the Los Angeles Angels, 9:07 p.m. Sean Burke versus Kyle Hendricks. Michael McGreevy versus Stephen Kolek in San Diego versus St. Louis, 9:10 p.m. So now my picks for August 2nd. I have San Diego defeating St. Louis. I have Chicago White Sox defeating the Los Angeles Angels. The Athletics defeats Arizona. Atlanta defeats Cincinnati. Seattle defeats Texas. San Francisco defeats the New York Mets. Miami defeats the New York Yankees. Minnesota defeats Cleveland. Let's see. Boston defeats Houston. Milwaukee defeats Washington. Detroit loses to Philadelphia. Pittsburgh defeats Colorado. Toronto defeats Kansas City. Baltimore defeats the Chicago Cubs. And Tampa Bay defeats the Los Angeles Dodgers, I'm sorry. So now we have the games for August 3rd. You have Houston versus Boston, 10:35 a.m. with Framber Valdez versus Richard Fitz. You have the Los Angeles Dodgers versus Tampa Bay, which will be Dustin May versus Undecided. You have Milwaukee versus Washington, 12:35 p.m. Jacob Misarowski versus Brad Lord. You have Kansas City versus Toronto, 12:37 p.m. Noah Cameron versus Chris Bassett. Minnesota versus Cleveland, 12:40 p.m. Simeon Woods Richardson versus Joey Cantillo. You have New York Yankees versus Miami, 12:40 p.m. Max Fried versus Edward Cabrera. You have San Francisco versus the New York Mets, 12:40 p.m. Undecided versus Frankie Montas. Baltimore versus Chicago Cubs, 1:20 p.m. Zach Eflin versus Matthew Boyd. You have Pittsburgh versus Colorado, 2:10 p.m. Mitch Keller versus Bradley Blaylock. You have Arizona versus the Athletics, 3:05 p.m. Eduardo Rodriguez versus J.P. Sears. You have the Los Angeles Angels versus the Chicago White Sox, 3:07 p.m. Davis Martin versus Jack Kukanowicz. You have St. Louis versus San Diego, 3:10 p.m. Andre Paliante versus Dylan Cease. You have Texas versus Seattle, 3:10 p.m. Patrick Corbin versus Logan Evans. You have Detroit versus Philadelphia, 6 p.m., which will be Troy Melton versus Christopher Sanchez. Now, my picks for August 3rd. I have Houston defeating Boston. Los Angeles Dodgers defeats Tampa Bay. Washington defeats Milwaukee. Toronto defeats Kansas City. Minnesota defeats Cleveland. New York Yankees defeats Miami. The New York Mets defeats San Francisco. Chicago Cubs defeats Baltimore. Pittsburgh defeats Colorado. Arizona will defeat the Athletics. The Los Angeles Angels will defeat the Chicago White Sox. San Diego defeats St. Louis. Texas defeats Seattle. And Philadelphia defeats Detroit. Now, for the games on August 4th of 2025, you have Houston versus Miami, 5:40 p.m. Undecided versus Sandy Alcantara. Minnesota versus Detroit, 5:40 p.m. Undecided versus Casey Mize. San Francisco versus Pittsburgh, 5:40 p.m. Justin Verlander versus Bailey Falter. Baltimore versus Philadelphia, 5:45 p.m. Charlie Morton versus Jesus Luzardo. Cleveland versus the New York Mets, 6:10 p.m. Slade Ciccone Ciccone versus Sean Manaea. You have Kansas City versus Boston, 6:10 p.m. Rich Hill versus Lucas Giolito. Milwaukee versus Atlanta, 6:15 p.m. Quinn Priester versus Eric Fed. You have Cincinnati versus the Chicago Cubs, 7:05 p.m. Nick Lodolo versus Colin Ray. The New York Yankees versus Texas, 7:05 p.m. Will Warren versus Nathan Eovaldi. Toronto versus Colorado, 7:40 p.m. Eric Lauer versus Tanner Gordon. Tampa Bay versus Los Angeles, 8:38 p.m. Zach Littell versus Yusei Kikuchi. San Diego versus Arizona, 8:40 p.m. Yu Darvish versus Brandon Pfaadt. St. Louis versus the Los Angeles Dodgers, 9:10 p.m. Sonny Gray versus Yoshinobu Yamamoto. Alrighty, now, with that, let's make the picks for August 4th. I have Houston defeating Miami, Minnesota defeats Detroit, San Francisco defeats Pittsburgh, Baltimore defeats Philadelphia, Cleveland defeats New York, Kansas City will defeat Boston, Atlanta loses to Milwaukee, Cincinnati defeats the Chicago Cubs, New York Yankees defeats Texas, Toronto defeats Colorado, Tampa Bay defeats Los Angeles, San Diego defeats Arizona, St. Louis defeats Los Angeles. Alright, so now, moving on to the games for August 5th of 2025. You have Houston versus Miami, 5:40 p.m. Undecided versus Cal Quantrill. Minnesota versus Detroit, 5:40 p.m. Undecided versus Chris Paddock. San Francisco versus Pittsburgh, 5:40 p.m. Logan Webb versus Mike Burrows. You have Baltimore versus Philadelphia, 5:45 p.m. Dean Kremer versus Tajuan Walker. You have the Athletics versus Washington, 5:45 p.m. Luis Severino versus Michael Soroka. You have Cleveland versus the New York Mets, 6:10 p.m. Logan Allen versus Clay Holmes. Kansas City versus Boston, 6:10 p.m. Seth Lugo versus Brayan Bello. You have Milwaukee versus Atlanta, 6:15 p.m. Freddie Peralta versus Joey Wentz. Cincinnati versus Chicago, 7:05 p.m. Nick Martinez versus Shota Imanaga. You have the New York Yankees versus Texas, 7:05 p.m. Marcus Stroman versus Kumar Rocker. You have Toronto versus Colorado, 7:40 p.m. Jose Barrios versus Kyle Freeland. Tampa Bay versus the Los Angeles Angels, 8:38 p.m. Ryan Pepiot versus Jose Soriano. You have Chicago White Sox versus Seattle, 8:40 p.m. Jonathan Cannon versus Brian Wu. San Diego versus Arizona, 8:40 p.m. Nick Pivetta versus Ryan Nelson. You have St. Louis versus the Los Angeles Dodgers, 9:10 p.m. Miles McCollus versus Tyler Glasnow. Now, my picks for August 5th. Miami defeats Houston. Detroit defeats Minnesota. Pittsburgh defeats San Francisco. Philadelphia will defeat Baltimore. The Athletics lose to Washington. New York Mets defeats Cleveland. Boston defeats Kansas City. Atlanta defeats Milwaukee. Cincinnati loses to the Chicago Cubs. Yeah, I know, unusual, but that's what my pick is. Texas will defeat New York Yankees. Colorado defeats Toronto. Los Angeles Angels defeats Tampa Bay. Seattle will defeat Chicago. Arizona will defeat San Diego. Los Angeles will defeat St. Louis. Now, for the games on August 6th, you have Baltimore versus Philadelphia with Trevor Rogers versus Ranger Suarez. You have San Francisco versus Pittsburgh, which is Robbie Ray versus Andrew Haney. Both of those games are at 11:35 a.m. And let's see, what else do we have? We have Cleveland versus the New York Mets, 12:10 p.m. Gavin Williams versus David Peterson. You have Minnesota versus Detroit, 12:10 p.m. Zebby Matthews versus Tariq Skubal. You have Cincinnati versus the Chicago Cubs, 1:20 p.m. Andrew Abbott versus Cade Horton. You have the New York Yankees versus Texas, 1:35 p.m. Carlos Rodon versus Jack Leiter. You have Colorado versus Toronto, 2:10 p.m. Kevin Gossman versus Antonio Senzatala. You have the Los Angeles Angels versus Tampa Bay, 3:07 p.m. Shane Baz versus Tyler Anderson. You have St. Louis versus the Los Angeles Dodgers, 3:10 p.m. Matthew Liberatore versus Undecided. You have Houston versus Miami, 3:40 p.m. Hunter Brown versus Jansen Junk. You have the Athletics versus Washington, 5:45 p.m. Jeffrey Springs versus Mackenzie Gore. Let's see. You have Kansas City versus Boston, 6:10 p.m. Michael Wacha versus Garrett Crochet, however it's pronounced. Sorry, I don't know. You have Milwaukee versus Atlanta, 6:15 p.m. Jose Quintana versus Undecided. You have Chicago White Sox versus Seattle, 8:40 p.m. Adrian Hauser versus George Kirby. You have San Diego versus Arizona, which will be 8:40 p.m. Randy Vasquez versus Merrill Kelly. And in those games on the 6th of August, I have Baltimore defeating Philadelphia, Pittsburgh defeats San Francisco. Let's see. The New York Mets defeats Cleveland, Minnesota defeats Detroit, Chicago Cubs defeats Cincinnati, Texas defeats the New York Yankees, Colorado defeats Toronto, the Los Angeles Angels defeats Tampa Bay, St. Louis defeats Los Angeles Dodgers, Miami loses to Houston, the Athletics defeat Washington, Kansas City defeats Boston, Milwaukee defeats Atlanta, Seattle defeats Chicago, Arizona defeats San Diego. Okay, so those are the games for August 6th. Now, the last day of games in question that we're going to go over this week, or this stream anyway. Thursday, August 7th, you have the Athletics versus Washington, 11:05 a.m. Jacob Lopez versus Mitchell Parker. Chicago White Sox versus Seattle, 3:10 p.m. Aaron Saval versus Logan Gilbert. You have Cincinnati versus Pittsburgh, 5:40 p.m. Brady Singer versus Paul Skenes. And then you have Miami versus Atlanta, 6:15 p.m. Yuri Perez versus Bryce Elder. So in those games, I have Washington defeating the Athletics, the Chicago White Sox defeat Seattle, Cincinnati defeats Pittsburgh, and Atlanta defeats Miami. So, just a quick review. Here are who I have winning the games August 1st through August 7th, and we'll go August 1st. Atlanta defeats Cincinnati, Chicago Cubs defeats Baltimore, Detroit defeats Philadelphia, Washington defeats Milwaukee, Kansas City defeats Toronto, Boston will defeat Houston, Minnesota will defeat Cleveland, Miami defeats the New York Yankees, San Francisco defeats the New York Mets, Tampa Bay defeats the Los Angeles Dodgers, Pittsburgh defeats Colorado, Los Angeles Angels defeat Chicago White Sox, St. Louis defeats San Diego, the Athletics defeat Arizona, Texas defeats Seattle. For August 2nd, Tampa Bay defeats the Los Angeles Dodgers, Baltimore defeats Chicago Cubs, Toronto defeats Kansas City, Colorado loses to Pittsburgh, Philadelphia defeats Detroit, Milwaukee defeats Washington, Boston beats Houston. Let's see. Minnesota to defeat Cleveland, Miami defeats the New York Yankees, San Francisco defeats the New York Mets, Seattle will defeat Texas, Atlanta defeats Cincinnati, the Athletics defeats Arizona, Chicago White Sox defeats the Los Angeles Angels, San Diego defeats St. Louis. For August 3rd, oh, no problem, Naomi, I'm glad that you joined me today. So, I'm almost done, but thank you for joining me today, I do appreciate you. For August 3rd, for August 3rd, I have Houston defeating Boston, Los Angeles Dodgers defeats Tampa Bay, Washington defeats Milwaukee, Toronto defeats Kansas City, Minnesota defeats Cleveland, New York Yankees defeats Miami, New York Mets defeats San Francisco, Chicago defeats Baltimore, Pittsburgh defeats Colorado, Arizona defeats the Athletics, the Los Angeles Angels defeats Chicago, San Diego defeats St. Louis, Texas defeats Seattle, and Philadelphia defeats Detroit. For August 4th, I have Houston defeating Miami, Minnesota defeats Detroit, San Francisco defeats Pittsburgh, Baltimore defeats Philadelphia, Cleveland defeats the New York Mets, Kansas City defeats Boston, Atlanta loses to Milwaukee, Cincinnati defeats Chicago Cubs, New York Yankees defeats Texas, Toronto defeats Colorado, Tampa Bay defeats Los Angeles Angels, San Diego defeats Arizona, St. Louis defeats the Los Angeles Dodgers. Thank you, and have a good day yourself, Naomi. Let's see. For August 5th, I have Miami defeating Houston, Detroit defeats Minnesota, Pittsburgh defeats San Francisco, Philadelphia defeats Baltimore, Washington defeats the Athletics, New York Mets defeats Cleveland. Boston defeats Kansas City. Atlanta defeats Milwaukee. Chicago Cubs defeats Cincinnati. Texas defeats New York Yankees. Colorado defeats Toronto. The Los Angeles Angels defeats Tampa Bay. Seattle defeats Chicago White Sox, sorry. Arizona defeats San Diego, and the Los Angeles Dodgers defeat St. Louis. For August 6th, I have Baltimore defeating Philadelphia, Pittsburgh defeating San Francisco. Let's see. New York Mets defeats Cleveland. Minnesota defeats Detroit. Chicago Cubs defeats Cincinnati. Texas defeats the New York Yankees. Colorado defeats Toronto. Los Angeles Angels defeats Tampa Bay. St. Louis defeats the Los Angeles Dodgers. Houston beats Miami. The Athletics defeats Washington. Kansas City defeats Boston. Milwaukee defeats Atlanta. Seattle defeats Chicago White Sox. Arizona defeats San Diego. And finally, for the games on August 7th, I have Washington defeating the Athletics, Chicago White Sox defeating Seattle, Cincinnati defeats Pittsburgh, Atlanta defeats Miami. So those are my picks, my perspective for the games of August 1st through 7th of 2024. Thank you for tuning into this broadcast today on Sports Law Media. I do greatly appreciate it. If you will, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. Please hit the notification bell so you can be made aware when I'm doing these live streams, when I have sports action videos, when I have sports education videos, again, when I broadcast live, or when I have breaking news in the sports world. If you wish to subscribe to my channel, it is greatly appreciated. You can do it in two different ways. One, you can go to www.youtube.com, the slash symbol, the at symbol, SPORTSLOV, or you can go to the YouTube search tab and type in Bob Amin. That is BOBAMIN. You'll know it's me because I have Sports Law Media burned into a basketball as my avatar. I'm also on Twitter X, and my handle there is at BobAmin16. That's the at symbol, BOBAMIN 16. Thank you again for tuning in to the broadcast today. Just a quick couple of announcements. One, we will be continuing to do these Major League Baseball live streams when appropriate. We will most likely be having more in the way of go-kart racing, just not sure when I'm going to be doing those again yet. And we will be starting the college football live streams in mid-August. And that will be on a weekly basis and stuff. We're going to try some stuff with NFL too. And again, that stuff is forthcoming. More announcements will be coming. In the meantime, as time goes on, we'll also continue having sports action and sports education videos. Breaking news will occur, and when it does, I'll do the best I can to report it. So, anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, anything they'd like to add? Well, if not, thank you again for tuning in to this broadcast today. I'm Bob Amin with Sports Law Media. Thank you again for tuning in today. I'm signing out now. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.